listening to the Bearded Theologians podcast, hosted by Zach Bechtold and Matt Franks. We hope you enjoyed today's podcast and check us out online at beardedtheologians.com. You're listening to the Bearded Theologians podcast, hosted by Matt Franks
and Zach Bechtold. And today we have one of our favorite guests returning with us, Pastor Matt Miofsky. He's pastor at the Gathering in St. Louis. And we had Matt on, a few months ago to talk about his book, Happiness, or Happy. And he's got a new book coming out called Fail, which I absolutely love because I feel like that's what we do on this podcast weekly. So Matt, great to have you, man.
Yeah, it's good to be back with you guys. Thanks for having me on again.
Absolutely. We love it. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in your life and with this new book, and we'll go from there.
Sure. Yeah. Well, my first book was Happy, What It Is and How to Find It. And I really wrote that, for two reasons. For people who maybe wouldn't normally pick up a book from a pastor or might never step foot into the church. And, I wanted to pick a topic that I know is on everyone's mind. So, everybody's kind of searching for what makes them happy. But it was kind of funny. I thought, what do I want to follow that up with? And a lot of people were surprised that I picked sort of the opposite end of the spectrum, fail, what to do when things go wrong. But it's really the same kind of book. I wanted to pick something that we all wrestle with. And so this book is really how do we navigate disappointments, obstacles, difficulties in our life? And because at least for me, I've found that while I don't want to repeat those low moments in my life, I often learn more from my mistakes or from those difficult spots than I do from any other period of life. And so I really wanted to kind of explore that and give people really kind of a guide on how to navigate those seasons that we all go through.
No, I love that. We like I said, we talk about that a lot here because we feel like we do it on a weekly basis. But we talk about it in the sense of if we're not failing at something, we're not trying something new. We're not, we're not giving ourselves a chance to branch out. And failure is part of that, and it's how we learn. What kind of response have you said you got some surprise, and why'd you go the other direction? What kind of response and practice have you got from your congregation or the folks that you fleshed this out with?
Well, the idea really I first got the idea a few years ago. I was talking to an educator friend of mine. He's not a church guy, but he's a principal at a private school. And he was talking then about the educational principle grit, which has since actually become fairly popular. But it's the idea that kids need to learn how to fail. And so if you always give kids a test they can pass, if you always encourage them and they always do well, they're actually not learning their most important lesson. So he said that at his school, they were actually structuring classroom experiences designed for kids to fail. And the real lesson was, how would they react to failure and how would they get over it? And I just found that a fascinating conversation, that you would actually want kids to fail so that they could learn how to get over it. And so I began sort of thinking about that in life. Not that I think God causes harm or tragedy in our lives, but of course we do believe in a God that can take failures, whether they're of our own causing or whether they're tragedies that happen to us, and can actually teach us some of our best lessons through that. And so I actually preached a sermon series in my church, and it was based on the biblical character of Jeremiah. Because Jeremiah in the Old Testament, he's known as the weeping prophet. This guy had a lot of things go wrong in his ministry, some which he was responsible for, most of it just due to circumstances of his life. But nonetheless, he learned a tremendous amount and ultimately had hope even in the most dire circumstances. So that series just really struck a chord. People really resonated with this idea. And I think there's something about a pastor or a church just acknowledging that life is messy and difficult and full of things that don't always make sense. And just recognizing that and not pretending like everything's going to go great just because you're a person of faith. I think was really refreshing. So that was a few years ago, but it really was the genesis of this particular book.
And I think that's interesting that it's amazing that how often we forget to talk about failure, and that all we ever want to talk about is where we succeed. And we go to those pastor conferences and everybody puts on their best face and nobody really says, hey, here's where I screwed up. But because I screwed up on this, it allowed me to learn this, or, and I think far too often we put together our polished stuff and we don't talk about the grit of, everyday ministry. I mean, my goal is at least to fail once every day. It's that way I feel better about myself, and I know I'm not perfect. And I joke about the bulletin because it always, every week there's some mistake in it. And it's like, hey, that just proves we're not perfect. And so I kind of like I'm real big on the notion of like celebrating our failure when it happens and saying, hey, it happened and here's what we learned from it, and move on. Because I felt like my church experience was, everything's got perfect. There's no room for failure. And, in life, that's not the case. I mean, and I always use this baseball metaphor, but we celebrate when a guy goes 1 for 3. And he fails those other 2 times or doesn't get on base those other 2 times, and that's a good thing. And, what if we started looking at our failures in church and our churches and in our lives and seeing where there's growth opportunities? I just kind of like the whole concept, and the book actually sounds like a really great book. I'm looking forward to getting my hands on that and seeing where that leads us.
Yeah, I think it's especially important for pastors, not just pastors, anybody in leadership position. I think failure is hard. It's so tied to our identity. What we do is so tied to our identity. I think for anyone who really feels called to their job or their vocation, and pastors in particular, I think really wrestle with this. There's a quote that's always stuck with me, that when you succeed, it goes to your head. When you fail, it goes to your heart. Meaning that when you succeed, you think more highly of yourself than you ought to, really. And in ministry, when you fail, it goes right to your heart. You begin to think of yourself as a failure. And that's dangerous when all of a sudden failure has the capacity to really go right to our understanding of who we are. And I think it's like that for a lot of people, that this isn't just a practical guide on how to get through difficult times, but it's also has a lot to say, I think, about our identity as ultimately people created by God. And we don't need to become anything other than who we are. Success doesn't lead us closer to God necessarily, and failure doesn't always take us further away. And so I do think it has a unique thing to say to pastors. We're in a climate right now, as you said, where we don't like to talk about our failures. And yet, let's be honest, a lot of church leadership right now is happening in environments that are largely failing. And our job is to sort of figure out a new way forward for the church, a new way forward for our church, a new way forward for a worship service or a Sunday school class, and that's hard work. And it usually means that we have to fail many times over before we hit on something that begins to work. So even in our practical day-to-day ministry, I laugh. I tell people all the time, people look at the gathering success stories, but they don't look at the number of things I've tried where, one person shows up or 2 people show up, which, by the way, is always worse than nobody. Nobody showing up at least means you get to go home.
Yeah.
Showing up means you got to go through it awkwardly for an hour, whatever it is you're doing. And so, I've had all sorts of experiences like that. In fact, I've probably had more of them. I just tend to fail fast and keep going. So,
well, and I think that's the important thing that we remember, whether it's in the church setting or whatever our setting is that when we fail, we need to fail fast, and not let that sink into your heart like that and just resonate and bring you down. Instead, pick up, see where the grace is, see where we learn, and move forward, and not dwell in what that failure is.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we fall into a lot of times as pastors is we don't like admitting failure. We don't like saying, okay, this thing just isn't going to work. It's dead. Right. And sometimes we spiritualize these things like, well, if it may be small, but, God's doing great things, or, don't give up, a miracle might happen. There's still this idea that we equate some ministry strategy, even the existence of a particular church, that somehow if we admit that it's done, either its life cycle is over, or it didn't work, or it's no longer working, that somehow we're giving up on God, or we're giving up on hope, or we're giving up on a confidence that faith is effective. And actually, I think the opposite is true, that we can say, hey, look, this isn't working anymore. This doesn't work, or this is over. It's done. And we believe in a God of death and resurrection. And so sometimes the beginning of hope comes actually when you're able to admit this thing's no longer working. And it's time to just admit that it's over, so that I can begin something new. We need that in churches right now. There are a lot of churches that are holding on to things, and they think that what it means to be faithful is never giving up. And sometimes what it means to be faithful is allowing something to end with the strong belief that we have a God of resurrection, that something new then will begin. But you never get to that if you can't sort of deal with failure. And I think it holds us back from the best things that God wants to do, because we're just so insistent that we got to keep trying this thing that we're doing.
Well, and
that's something that I started this new church out on. My second sermon in, it's like, look, we've got to grieve some things.
Yeah.
It's okay to grieve. It's okay to acknowledge the things that we've lost and that we're going to lose, but it's because we believe in this. We believe in the resurrection that that's where we find hope. Mm-hmm. And so, not the churches that I serve aren't currently grieving a lot other than transition, but it's this idea of there's a lot in your life in general that maybe you haven't let go, maybe you haven't grieved, and we need to do that. Here's your permission to do that so we can move forward.
And would you say that maybe part of the problem that we have is that one, we don't emphasize failure enough. And I think of the leagues and stuff where kids, they get a trophy even if they went 25, or we think about death, and we've probably all three been in the situation where we've sat with a family that has grieved, and they can't let go of that grief. They just refuse to let go of the grief. And I think the same thing when failure is that we do have this sense of heart, we don't want to let go of it. And yet instead of moving on and moving forward, we just are held on by that grief so much that it kills us. And you think of the church, and I've been in a lot of churches that's been the situation, that they know that the ministry is dead, and that but they don't want to let go of it because they're so attached to it. There's been blood, sweat, and tears in this thing, and to let go of it means, it's a new thing in a new direction, and that's always scary for people. And so I think maybe as pastors, if we can help people see the resurrection and how new life can come out of failure, wherever that direction may be, and be, real biblical about that, I think there's some hope that we can provide in the midst of all this craziness that we're in right now.
Well, I think you're right. There's, I get asked this all the time. I'll go and talk to churches who want new life breathed into their church, whether it's, worship's in decline for years and years, and they want to figure out how they can grow again, or how can we attract young people, or how can we recover a sense of vitality. But they don't phrase it this way. But what they usually want to know is, how can we change just enough things so that we can reach new people and grow, while at the same time not angering, upsetting the people that are here, or really losing anything that we have. So what's the sweet spot of enough change that people will come, but not so much change that people here get upset or have to grieve things? And I always tell them, that's what everyone wants to know. And I tell them, I don't know how to do that. I'm not your speaker. If what you want is, how can we not upset the people who are here, and at the same time change enough to grow? That's why, by the way, for a period in our history, the answer to everything was start a new worship service. Now, I'm not saying don't ever start a new worship service, but most of the time, starting a new worship service didn't work because we didn't want to anger this group. So we said, you all keep worshiping over here, and I'm going to try to start something over here. And so we tried to have it both ways. And usually churches didn't have the resources or the people or the man or woman power to pull that off. So I think even in churches, the churches that actually are finding new life, the churches that are actually turning around or revitalizing, they really are those churches that are able to say, look, we have got to be willing to lose some things, to just let some things die that we love, by the way. We've got to let go of that stuff with the belief that when we do, something new will emerge. And I think the same thing is true of our lives. I mean, you don't have to be a church leader to see that sometimes in our lives, we want to know, how can I change just enough that new things will happen for me without risking much or letting go of things that feel very comforting to me. And it's oftentimes when we let go of things that are comforting, or we're forced to let go of those things, that we find new life. So to give a real brief example, you guys know in our churches, there's all sorts of people who don't like their jobs. I know people who hate their jobs. They've hated it for a decade. And when I say, well, why don't you make a change? Well, they just can't let go of the certainty of that paycheck or the stability that it offers in order to see what might come next. But then something comes along, and this happens to a few people, where they get fired, and I'm not wishing that on anybody. I mean, none of us want to get fired. And yet, oftentimes people use that low point and they're forced to reinvent life. All of a sudden, new things start to emerge in the midst of that obstacle or that setback. And that's really an example of what I think the book is trying to show us is I don't want anyone to get fired. I don't hope that on anybody. I don't think God causes evil all the time, but sometimes when things like that happen, we can look at it as total disaster, or we can look at it as like a fertile ground for something new to crop up. And what of course the good news of the scriptures teach us is that God can always use those moments. Even something as devastating as the death of a loved one can be a fertile ground for something new to spring up. And I've seen that over and over again in my ministry, as I'm sure you all have. So setbacks, obstacles, failures don't mean the end of our story.
No, I love that. And gosh, you're so right. And I'm like, Matt, I can't wait to get my hands on this and begin to chew on it a little bit and begin to present it with the folks that I serve, because it is important. And I think people just need, I don't know, as pastors or as leaders or whatever our arena is, if permission is what people need, like you say, I don't want people to get fired. I don't want people to lose their job, but I also don't want to see people unhappy. And so how do I, as a leader, begin to help that, begin to massage all of that?
And one practical, thought experiment I'll often do with people is I'll say, look back and tell me, if you had to pick 1, 2, 3 defining moments in your life where, just something really significant and positive changed for you. Tell me about those moments. And it's amazing how many people will trace those back to moments that were really difficult for them, that when they were going through them felt really hard. So oftentimes people will say, well, it was when I was fired from that job, 15 years ago, but it was in the midst of that I found this, or it's when I went through that divorce that was awful at the time. And again, but after that, I reinvented, I found that it forced me to think about, it was when I hit rock bottom as an alcoholic, and, my family had to confront me, but right after that, something new sprung up in my life. So it's amazing how often our defining moments come right on the heels of something that we would never want or wish. And yet that's so often the way life works. So Yeah, and so that's really why I wrote it. I think it'll apply to pastors, but it comes as a book and a leader's guide so that churches can use it either as a sermon series or even in small groups or Sunday school classes. And my hope, of course, is it just helps people process, setbacks, disappointments in life, because we certainly know those are going to happen.
Yeah, as you were talking about using it as a sermon series, I used your Happy book in my last appointment, and the response from it was really great. People really loved the book. Like I couldn't keep the book on my shelf, which is always a great thing. I know it's a great thing for you, but I really appreciated some of the insights that you had with that book, and it made it really easy for us to use in our worship experience. And as you were talking about failure, I was thinking, and this book coming out, like, man, this is going to be a great book to kick the year off with, and just, and just say, hey, this would be a kind of a good topic to start the year off with. It's a different way of thinking and moving forward.
It's actually when we used it, Matt, at the gathering, when I first preached this series several years ago, it was right after the new year. And a lot of people thought it was a counterintuitive, like, hey, let's talk about something really hopeful. It is actually hopeful. That's the cool thing about it is, it's titled Fail, What to Do When Things Go Wrong. But the gist of it really is hope that on the cusp of a new year, the thing that holds us back the most is not letting go of what happened last year, not letting go of what we need to let go of so something new can emerge. So ultimately the gist of it is hope, even though it's hope via a difficult path.
Right.
Well, it's funny that you bring that at the beginning of the year when most, when so many people do the New Year's resolutions and 6 weeks later they've already failed. And, what a great way to begin the year with that of, look, hey, we've got these things and let's talk about it and find hope in it.
Yeah, I joke with my congregation. The reason a lot of New Year's resolutions fail is because we try to add something without subtracting something else. And so we just keep adding things to our life. And so again, it's sort of this idea that let's take care of some subtraction so that we can do some addition.
It's always my encouragement for Lent, for that season as
right,
well.
Yeah.
Hey, you guys add something on, please take something off your plate.
Right.
Because otherwise,
Zach, how did that work when you did your napping?
It's fantastic. So I gave up, or I added on napping a couple of years ago for Lent, and it was one of the best spiritual practices I've done because it was super intentional about just not doing anything.
When did you nap, Zach? Like in the middle of the day in your office?
Yeah, I had a chair in my office that sat in the window, so it was nice and warm, and I'd conk out for about 30 minutes. It's great.
Well, Matt, we look forward to the book coming out September 5th. This podcast will come out, I think, September 1st, around there. And so we'll have a link so people can pick up the book on our website and through all of our things. And we appreciate your time, Matt. And, you're always welcome to come back. And, when the next book comes out, let us know. We'll be glad to have you back on. But we enjoy all that you do for the kingdom, and we thank you for your time. And so, just go on our website. We've got a lot of great content up. Leia's post on was it welcoming? I think that's what it was. Church Bingo.
Church Bingo. How welcoming is your church?
It's a pretty good read. I would encourage you to look at that. Our conversation with Del Fredrickson was awesome. And it actually would parallel with this conversation because we talk a lot about resurrection in that one. So, go back and listen to that one. But we appreciate everybody's time. And so for the Bearded Theologians, I'm Matt Franks.
I'm Zach Bechtold. And thanks for checking us out.
Thank you for listening to the Bearded Theologians podcast. We hope you've enjoyed listening, and we hope that you share our content online through Facebook and social media, and we hope that you check out our Beardcast store at beardedtheologians.com and pick up some great Bearded Theologians gear. We hope you have a good day.